if you think of it in a different way and you have the right people around you, you can almost overcome most obstacles.
What is the responsibility of a CEO?
Do you think a CEO has a responsibility to ask the questions that are uncomfortable about how they're perceived as a leader by their team, but also by the market?
A mentor said to me, be tough on issues and soft on people. Make it not about winning, make it about fixing and learning. Okay, welcome back to the CEO Advantage podcast. I'm here with my co-host, Millie Albers. I'm Paul Edginton, and today we have Alexandra with us. Alex is the founder and CEO of the Big Smoke Media Group, a publication and full-stack digital agency operating in Australia and the USA. She's a regular commentator on ABC TV, and she is absolutely inspirational. I've had the good fortune of doing some work with Alex, and it's just amazing. So I'm really glad to have you with us today, Alex. Thank you.
Thanks so much for having me.
Alex, the first question we ask every CEO that we get on is, what was your first job?
So there's two sides to that story. My first job was when I would steal remote controls from my grandparents and sell it, which is extortion, but it got me a few dollars. And but then my first proper job, which would be, more legal, was at checkout chick at Franklin's. Do you remember Franklin's? Used to be the no-frills supermarket. I don't think it's around anymore. But I was the checkout chick at Franklin's, and I thought it was absolutely fun.
Brilliant. So tell us about the Big Smoke Media and where you are now, and then we'll go back to Franklin's. But give us, that's how Franklin's in. Give us what is Big Smoke Media and what does that do?
Well, it started in 2013 initially as almost like a Huffington Post type competitor. It was just a publication. And the idea was at the time there was a lot of news, but not a lot of opinion pieces. Now we've kind of 10 years later, it's the reverse. There's so much opinion and less news. But at the time, that's what it was. And then a few years into that, it's still there. But a few years into that, we realized from a business model perspective, we weren't really adding that much value to our clients because, they could put an article on our site or a banner, but they could also do that on Meta, on Google, so how do you become more valuable to your clients? And so we just learned really quickly that, a lot of our clients were in the same boat as many businesses, which is they're just trying to survive and grow and become a reputable, credible company. And how do they do that? Well, we do that with them through building their websites, through PR, through social media. So it became full stack. It became anything digital because that's what I realized these guys needed. And they were also feeling really overwhelmed with how much was out there. So we tried to really just break that down and make it completely accessible and understandable from their perspective so it's less overwhelming.
And so give us a sense of, you've got a really great board, you've got a really great team around you. Give us a picture of who you've surrounded yourself with in the Big Smoke.
I made every mistake possible, but one thing I've done well is choose good people to be on my board. I've got some really great people. One of my favorite people is Philippa Lewis, who was my chair. She's been with me for nearly 6 years now. Then we have other people on our board, such as Tony Nash, who founded Booktopia, Jane Caro, who's a great journalist. There's a number of different people across different disciplines in finance, in law, in corporate and in journalism. And that has really helped me have like a sounding board of the right type of leaders. But then within the business, working in the day-to-day, I have some really great leaders that have really filled the gap of where I'm not good. For a long time, I tried to do everything the way I thought it should be done, but I've become a lot more comfortable with leaning into my strengths and then pushing my weaknesses onto other people to execute.
It's amazing in my early leadership career, you'd have this idea, you get consultants or trainers tell you that, why don't you, if you work on your weaknesses, and I can always remember thinking, why would I do that? Like, if you're really clever and you work on your weaknesses, you may reach the heights of mediocre. I always sort of thought, why don't I just pay someone to do the stuff that I'm not that great at, and I'll be really great at what I'm great at, and then try and keep the ship together. Is that what you found?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also about time. I mean, if you have time to do all of that and become great at everything that you're not great at, will you have time to be able to be commercially, competitive because your industry is moving so fast? Do they have time to wait for you to figure it all out? Probably not. So it's probably easier and faster for you to bring in the right people who have those skill sets, often 10, 15 years worth of experience that you're not really going to be able to fast track for yourself. So I think that's right. I think it's really about finding and paying for the right people to come in to help you lead and execute. It doesn't mean that, most CEOs really are good at one or two key things. And that's why they have a C-suite, or that's why they have a leadership team. So, yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense.
How many people in the team, Alex?
So there's about 30 people altogether at the moment in Australia. Then we've got a few extra people in the US. And they sort of range from roles such as I've got a COO to, head of content to a head of development to a head of PR. So just different people in different disciplines. So the goal was really to make sure that we could service what our clients needed. And primarily was to create thought leaders out of our clients, really. So most of the people in our team focused on a discipline in that space more than anything.
One of the themes that we've been exploring on our podcast is these two brands of CEO, the founder CEO and the professional CEO, and looking at the similarities and differences. You're in the founder CEO category. From an early age, did you know that you wanted to run things? Were you one of those people as a child always?
Yeah, well, I'm an only child. So you can imagine that in my mind, I ran the house when I was 7. But, I think that for me, it made sense to sort of manage things or lead things. But I would argue that I've become better as an adult, or as I've transitioned in my career from a founder CEO mindset to a corporate CEO mindset. And I think that a lot of businesses that don't do well tend to be because they're still stuck in that founder CEO mentality. So things like, investing more in their team as opposed to just trying to, make revenue targets, or making sure that they're focused on compliance rather than just, making sure that their zero is set up. It's all of those little things that a lot of people try to put to the side. And I did as well. But I feel like I've learned now the importance of that. But I have to say, I did my MBA before I started my business. Mm-hmm. And I would argue that I learned really nothing from the MBA that helped me in business. What helped me in business was the hard stuff. All I can remember during my MBA was being obnoxious in class. I don't remember anything that was helpful. So yeah, I think that's where the management side is really interesting, of how people evolve as managers.
You studied an MBA. At what point was that straight out of school? What did you study first?
I had an interesting educational experience because what I did was I was in high school. I left at the end of year 10, which most of my friends did at the time. I don't know if you remember, but in the 90s, it was really, I mean, it might still be like this now. In the 90s, it was really popular to leave in year 10 and go and do a trade, so a hairdresser or, something like that. So everyone left at the end of year 10. And I ended up going to a music college and then a secondary school. And then I just started working for a few years, about 5 or 6 years. And then I eventually ended up going back to uni. And so I had to do sort of like a bridging degree course to get into doing my master's. I did that. And then I started doing a law degree just as I started the company. And then that's when I left uni. So I didn't finish that. But yeah, so I had a little bit of a backwards way of getting to my master's, which was actually helpful because I don't think I would have understood it or learnt from it in the same way I did, even though it wasn't much, when I was 18, 19. Well, I still would argue that had I not started the company and it took off, that I would have probably finished my law degree and gone into law, because I actually find that really interesting. And I do also like arguing. So I think that would have been a nice career path for me. But it was just a matter of being opportunistic, if I'm honest. When I started the business, I had just started the law degree and I couldn't do both. It was taking off. It was doing quite well. And I just had to pull out of law school because I couldn't give both of it my attention. And anyone who knows what it's like to build a company from nothing knows it's quite a traumatic experience. So it's really difficult to just be cool and at uni half a day and then working at night. Like, it just doesn't really work. So yeah, I left. I made a choice.
When you started at the Big Smoke, did you have a big, bold vision to just transform, help change media? or were you just going to just jump into it and wing it and see how it goes kind of approach?
I wanted to transform media, but at the time it was when Huffington Post was doing really well, and before they sold, or around the time they sold to AOL, and I think it was for like $350 million or something. And then they just started in Australia. So I saw a gap. At the time, a lot of different media pop-ups were happening in Australia. The Loop, which was Wendy Harmer, which is now gone, and Mamma Mia had just started. And I just thought that there was a really nice opportunity for opinion pieces by critical thinkers that weren't journalists.
Were you working for somebody else in that space, or did you just dived into it yourself? And and if so, that's pretty entrepreneurial.
Stupid as well. You would argue, like on reflection, I would recommend anyone work in the industry for years before they, build in it. I did it the opposite. I didn't know that much about it. But actually, on reflection, that was a good thing because it meant I didn't come in with the same ideas that everyone else had in the industry. So I was trying to be more innovative, and I was trying to think of ways to be more value from a content perspective. But would it have been easier had I had more experience? Yes, I think I would have fast-tracked commercial growth quicker. It took me a lot longer than it should have to get the business model right.
How long did it take you?
I would say 4 years, which sounds like a really long time now. But, if you think about a lot of companies, they take a number of years to really kill it. They don't, unless they're getting funding straight up. I didn't get funding. I bootstrapped it. So I didn't have the luxury of being able to afford a bunch of consultants and different people to help. So it was really me figuring things out. It was me getting some people around me that believed in what I was doing. And some of those people are still with me now, 10 years later. And it was just really about trying to find ways to survive. But when I look at the statement, my profit and loss statements, I don't know how I afforded to do anything because I made hardly any money. I don't know how I afforded my rent. And I cannot remember how that wasn't, I think I did like 30K or something in 1 year in 2014. I don't know how I survived on that. But you make it work and it worked. Yeah.
I was just thinking, so media is such an interesting world and sector right now. Where do you think what does the future of media look like, and especially how the young generation to try and get them off, the likes of TikTok, Instagram, just sharing all this useless content with each other to actually really take media seriously and to, discover and find
I don't think that we can. I think that what's going to happen is we're going to see more and more of our news sources becoming either really strong, maybe exposés or investigative pieces with analysis from really critical people, but then a majority of it's going to be ChatGPT type content, almost like the Yahoo News, the way they churn that out on different platforms. And then I think people are going to become more obsessed with individuals that they trust on TikTok and Instagram. So that might be a newsreader, but it'll be a newsreader who's talking about, what's happening in a certain area of the world. And they'll go into that, and then the people will learn from those people. I think there's still a place for media in the media company format, but I think it becomes more of an aggregator of voices as opposed to the media company being the trusted voice. The fight is always going to be that they have to remain credible, and they can only be credible with the right people that they're promoting. So I think the place for media is going to be really difficult, and I don't think the money is going to be there the way it has been for advertising and the business model, and that's why we don't rely on advertising at all, which is a unique position to be in as a publication, and it's actually very good because it means we're not bowing to editorial changes based on an advertiser. So I think that the role of media is going to be more TikTok and Instagram. And I think that other platforms like that will actually, propel people who are great critical thinkers to become more and more popular. And they will be the ones you follow.
Alex, the AI has been in the background of media articles now for quite a few years. And as a pedant who I can't stand all of the how many grammatical errors there are, how many you just see it and you go, this is not written by, where's the sub-editor who checked this stuff? When I did journalism back in the 80s, you would never have got away with such trashy quality now, or an expectation. You see bylines on stuff where you're like, really? I wouldn't put my name on. I wouldn't put my name on that story written so poorly. And in India now, and during the election in India, they're now talking about deep politicians asking for deep fakes of their opponents or even deep fakes of themselves. And recently in the media, they were talking about a candidate being endorsed by a well-known actor who's been dead for 2 years. In a world where we don't know what's real and who's written what, or whether it's really the person saying it, what's the role of organisations like the Big Smoke, who really has you could argue we don't have any responsibility, we're just a reflection rather than a creator. But how do you see the world in it and your role in it, where there's less and I guess the line between what's real and not real is really, really crossing over?
I feel a really great obligation to ensure that people have the full spectrum of understanding of a situation. And the way I approach that is by having different views on a particular subject, right? And then the audience can make up their mind. However, in saying that, I think there is an onus on platforms like YouTube or TikTok or whoever to actually be able to identify if something's AI generated or deep fake and have a sort of like a label. In the same way on Facebook at the moment, if you post an article that's clearly fake news or misinformation, there's an automatic, tag that says this is proved to be false. I think that something like that should exist for video content. If you're putting out a video of a politician making a statement and it's 4:00 in the morning and it's a really combative statement, it's gone, it's circulated, it's on the news, and 2 hours later we find out it's deepfake, that 2-hour period could be too late, right? So I feel like there should be some automation around the tracking and the awareness side of that kind of footage. That would have to come down actually though to legislation and for people to be, responsible for that kind of transparency. And that's where I think it becomes difficult, because you're already seeing what's happening in the US with TikTok.
Yeah, it's challenging too from a legislation point of view, that if you legislate in Australia for something that's generated in India or generated in the US, so you're outside 100%. The reach of the legislators, right?
Yeah, and I think that's why education becomes so important. But it's also why I think that people are going to become more obsessed with an individual that they like on TikTok and Instagram, because they'll know if that's real or not. Do you see what I mean? It's almost like they'll go to I've done this myself, where I've read an article and I'm going, I don't know if that's quite right. And then I've gone to Instagram of the person who was part of the article, and you'll see their response to it. So you can kind of get a really quick lens on, what's true, what's not. But at the moment, I'm not sure if you've seen this, but I've been inundated with ads recently of Gina Reinhart and other people talking about ASX stocks, and this is how you're going to make a lot of money, and it's clearly deep fake. I mean, Gina Reinhart sitting there going, I'm going to teach you how to, trade shares. I mean, and people are signing up and joining their WhatsApp groups. And so I think it's going to be, with AI, it's going to become harder and harder for the average person to be able to tell the difference. So there will be onus on the platforms. Now, how do you police that globally? Well, that's where it's complicated for government and just the infrastructure of how these platforms work. But I do feel like it's going to become almost like the war of fake news over the next few years. People will just not know what's true or what's not. And going to be really fascinating to see what outlets survive that period, because it's going to require more diligence on their part to not let things go. Your point before about ChatGPT content, who read this and why haven't they checked it? I think there's going to be more of an expectation that there's going to be a lot more of a transparency as to how things are written. So whether there is ChatGPT used or not, but also who does it. But can I just say this to you? You're going to hate this. But on Instagram, a lot of well-known thought leaders write things like they'll just do little tiles with quotes or statements. They'll purposefully spell things wrong because that's more likely to keep you rereading it for a second. So if you're going through and you're reading and you're like, oh, there's a type of
pedants like me who are going, is that wrong? I fall for the gag.
Yeah. So it's almost like, and then people are like, you need to get an editor. Well, it's intentional and it made you comment. Like it's just interesting. But yeah, that's
I think it's interesting too when you think about what you just said from in our education system, teaching not only young people seem to be able to see this much more clearly than older people. But in terms of from an education point of view, teaching kids to do things that AI can do is actually consigning them to being disadvantaged, whereas teaching critical thinking and the ability to have conversations rather than what we're seeing at the moment particularly in the US, you're seeing a lot, and but in Australia as well, lots of shouty, because social media getting attention is often about being intentionally shouty. But from a community point of view, becoming without becoming cynical, but becoming skeptical of what you see, and then being able to converse about what we see. Do you see again that there's a future or an emergence of the art of conversation that's part of our future as opposed to an erosion of it through social media?
Well, that's why I kind of feel like, we've seen a number of different stories that have come out to say that, everything's going to be AI and the newsreaders are going to be robotic and blah, blah, blah. And I think that, people are going to get a lot more focused on the people that they trust, and they'll be able to tell quickly who is not real and who is real. But to your point around education, I absolutely believe that young people need to be taught about how to use AI in a critical way and how to fast track their own growth in their careers using AI, as opposed to seeing it as the thing that's going to take their jobs or something to be afraid of. We're already seeing a lot of students use robotics in their classes to learn. We're seeing people in Japan who are dealing with, the aging process and dementia use robotics in their homes in a much more seamless way than we do here. I feel like that's going to become the norm. But rather than it be perceived as eroding our trust in media, I think that the media really just has a very big responsibility to constantly reiterate their own rigor of how they process the editorial content and who's involved in that process. And I think that the ones that will survive will be the ones that can use AI effectively, as opposed to pretend it's not happening or completely lean into it. So it's that balance, and that balance requires critical thinking and analysis of how to understand a situation.
Can I use the word responsibility? So can I just come to the responsibility of CEOs, particularly commercial CEOs, right? We've seen, obviously we've had the treat this year of seeing the CEO of Qantas sort of going, we made a $1.4 billion surplus. Is that going to be awesome? What do you mean? And shareholders being angry about that. And like, how did you intergalactically miss the part where you illegally sacked people, you got taxpayer funded stuff, and you just missed all of these social license cues, and just thought the profit was going to do the job. What is the responsibility of a CEO, whether you're a founder and it's your company, or the CEO of an ASX listed company? Do they have a responsibility beyond shareholders to think beyond just their own company and bottom line? What do you see as the responsibilities of a CEO in the wider community?
I think that we see a lot of CEOs talking about values and mission, and, they have sustainability targets and diversity targets, and they have all these different things. And I often find that most of that is just a quota that they're trying to meet to be perceived as progressive or a forward-thinking company. I think that really good CEOs are thoughtful about their people and the way their people feel within the organization. And that doesn't mean that things will always be perfect, because it's a company and it's never going to be perfect. However, I do think a CEO has a responsibility to ask the questions that are uncomfortable about how they're perceived as a leader by their team, but also by the market. And so when it comes to responsibility, I think many CEOs are starting to realize now that it's more important to be, a great commercially viable CEO. Like you're really leading your people into profitability, and you have to make sure it's commercially viable. However, in saying that, you also need to be thinking about what's the next 10 years like. And if you've, done what we've seen some high-profile CEOs do, which is show a disregard for their teams show a disregard for their brand, show a disregard for the law. I think we all make mistakes in our companies with so many different elements, and some are more serious than others. But I think if you're thinking from the lens of how can I be better, because after this role I might want to sit on boards, or I might want to be a CEO of another company, or I might want to enter politics, or I might want to read a book. When you're thinking of that timeline, maybe you would treat people a little bit better because you're thinking about, how you're going to be perceived over the next 10, 15, 20 years. So I think the responsibility does come down to what can people say about you from an ethics perspective, even if mistakes get made. So with, Qantas, for example, there's a really big difference between mistakes being made and then fixed, which we see a lot of companies trying to do, and then just having a total disregard for what's happened and then leaving.
So do you have a 10-year, talking about like a 10-year plan, do you have a 10-year plan for the big smoke, and what does your growth, so are you looking for advanced growth, you're looking to expand the team, incorporate, really innovative technologies, or steady, or you're looking for an exit plan? How are you looking at it?
So at the moment, we're in the process of acquiring 2 companies as part of a growth plan. So one of them is a branding agency, another one's a podcast agency. And we're looking to fast track our growth through strategic acquisitions. Mm-hmm. That's one thing. But also then increase our global reach. So at the moment, we're in Australia, we've got a bit in America, but I want to expand more. That's why I'm trying to build the leadership team here. So my goals are really around how do we become of most value over the next 10 years. And those, I have 10-year goals in terms of where the company could go, but that changes based on opportunities in the market. And where I thought I would be now is different to how I thought before COVID. And so I think for me, it's more around at a high level, where could the company go, but how the steps get there is a little bit that changes.
Mm-hmm. Tell us about what's happening in America. You spent some time over there this year, and you've got a big smoke happening in the big smoke. Talk a little bit about that.
The interesting thing about America is they don't really get the big smoke name.
Huh.
So they don't see it as the Big Apple, which is New York.
Yeah.
They see it as maybe associated with marijuana or smoke and mirrors. Hilarious. They don't really think of it as a city. So the name doesn't necessarily translate. But, in America, I find it much more transactional, which I actually like. Mm. There's a lot of hunger to contribute, and there's a lot of fast decision making. I like both markets. They've both got their strong points. But my husband is from New York, and I love New York. So I've got a real affinity and a heart for New York. But America at large is a very complicated beast of a country. And just even if you see what's happening now in the media with social media and the colleges and everything like that, I mean, you can see how disenfranchised so many people are. Mm. So with that becomes an obligation and a responsibility on media companies to make sure that they're putting as much content out there that they can to educate people on different elements. Mm-hmm. So going back to your initial question about responsibility and the media, I think that now as I look at America where they are now, it's the perfect time to actually invest more in good media.
You also talked about American companies and American CEOs contribute differently. Certainly in terms of philanthropy and volunteering, there's a very different mindset in the US to Australia. How do you see that?
Again, that's complicated. A complicated question because depending on what demographic you're talking to, there's different obligations as to why somebody might be philanthropic. So there's interesting analysis that's been done in the US around why the Jewish community is so philanthropic, particularly around Washington and New York, which is really fascinating. And then you see a lot more people wanting to have a life where it ends up being that they are on a charity fund. So, something's happening in their life and one day they're going to have a charity. And we see that a little bit here, but less so here. And I think one of the reasons we see it less so here is because we assume that there's so many other people doing it that we could contribute to it. Whereas in the US, it's kind of this feeling of it's not quite what I need, that they're not doing quite what I need. So I'm going to start my own version of that. It's going to meet this need or it's going to do that. And so it's there's a lot more opportunity in this sheer size of the country and the people involved. But I think when it comes to philanthropic endeavours, there seems to be a lot more of a passion for it in the US that I've seen.
Do you
There
think
is a lot of passion here, but it tends to be either very emotional in the sense that it's emotion driven. So it's when you see a sad ad and you donate some money, or you might be part of a community that actually invests in something, which is great. But I see in the US a lot more people wanting to start things like funds or charities and things like that.
And do you think that's because there's more issues in the US, whether it be the healthcare, more homelessness?
More issues, but also, to be honest with you, more confidence that they can do it better than someone else.
True. Yeah, I noticed that too when
you know
I was
what I mean?
living
Like
there.
it's kind of like there is a sense of, well, they've got something similar to what I'm thinking, but it's not quite what I would have done, so I'm going to do it better. And there isn't that kind of gap of, can I do it better?
Yeah.
So it's just, it's an interesting mindset, one that I resonate probably more with than I do the mindset here.
Yeah.
In my 25 years as a CEO, one of the hardest things to find was a consulting and advisory firm where they'd actually been CEOs. I created CEO Advantage to be the advisory firm I was looking for. Go to ceoadvantage.com.au and find out how we can help you and your team be the best in the business. So talk about your transition. I want to go back to this, you becoming a corporate CEO and the way you're thinking. So the way you're thinking about growth through acquisition and growth into the US and all of those sort of things. But let's go back in time to the early Alex in the Big Smoke as the founder, and talk to me about some of the things that happened in that evolution that helped you shift from founder CEO, because so many founder CEOs or founders don't make it to being a CEO. The business gets stuck with them saying, nobody does it like me and you've got to do it this way. And they just can't get there. Talk about, so for someone listening who may be in that spot or wants to avoid that spot, who's got to the other side of it, can you talk about your journey through from one side to the other?
I think when I was more of a founder CEO, I think that I was very much fear-driven and driven by chutzpah as well. And what I mean by that is you're scared all the time because there's no safety net. You don't really know what you're doing and you don't really have, a whole team, and you don't have a bunch of lawyers and accountants supporting you, and you're not in a corporate structure that gives you that safety net that you're making the right decisions or temperature checks your decision making. So I think that there is a sense of fear in what you're doing. That's why I talk about the first years of being an entrepreneur as being quite traumatic, because I'm not, unless you've founded a company from nothing with no funding, you don't really understand what it feels like to have to push and push and push and just try to survive for a few years. And it's a difficult thing to do. And it's something that changes you as a person, I think, a lot. And that's why there's a lot of, stories around, the companies that don't make it, because I think that we need to hear the stories of the companies that don't make it to understand what we could have done better ourselves as CEOs. And I think that the transition for me really came down to seeing myself as, instead of seeing myself as an entrepreneur who was trying to run a business, that I was a CEO who was responsible to stakeholders and to a market. And it was actually the mindset of, I have responsibility and have a healthy fear of not being compliant. So for example, in your first early years, you don't really take as seriously things like what the tax office says. You're not really listening to the budget that much. You're just trying to survive. You're just trying to survive your little business, and you're not really caring that much about, are all my systems set up? Are all my contracts compliant? Have I got, you're not thinking that way. You're thinking about survival. And then there comes a point where you get sued for a bad contract, or something goes really wrong financially or legally, or you make a mistake with your taxes. I mean, everything that could go wrong, people can survive, but they can't survive it if they're only seeing themselves as through the lens of, I'm a scared entrepreneur and I don't know what to do. And I think that if you think of it in a different way and you have the right people around you, you can almost overcome most obstacles if you think about it as and this is the way I try to think about it. Whenever I feel stuck in a situation, I try to say, if I was advising another founder, what would I tell them to do right now? And usually it's the very thing that I should be doing. And for some reason, there's a mental block. in why you're not just thinking about it for yourself. But then you realize. So for me, it became really critical for me to study things like corporate finance. I mean, there's a big difference between being able to understand a basic P&L and being able to forecast accurately and understand cash flow predictability and understand, I would argue that you don't need to do an MBA if you want to be a good CEO. You should be doing law and corporate finance because they're the two areas that can trip you up if you don't have the right advice around you. And if you're just saying yes to people because you don't know, that's when you can get into trouble. So they're the things that I would have done better. But I think for me, it was the mindset of obligation. Obligation is the big one in a good way. I don't think of it as a resentful thing. I think of it, I have an obligation to be a good CEO to my people and to the market and to my husband and to my pugs because they're trying to have the best life too. They need a good CEO.
Yes. So you still feel that that sense of obligation was at the origin and it still lives with you, drives you now. Right?
Stronger now than it was then. Because 10 years ago, I didn't have as much to lose. If something didn't go right, it wasn't that big of a deal, right? Now, it would be a huge deal because I've got so many people like I'm responsible for, and you're paying with large amounts of money. So it's not, as simple as, I've got a small debt, I can't work it out, I did this. And you have an obligation to see it right through. And I think what makes people upset about a CEO who fails is if they haven't done what they had to do to see it through. So when we talk about, there was a famous story a couple of years ago about a guy in Australia who started a number of tech startups in the US and they failed and he was burning through, I can't remember how much, but they were burning through $10 million a month but only doing $50K a month in revenue and they've been highly funded and all that. And he just, really drove that company into the ground. What upset people more about that situation wasn't that he failed at his business, but that he kept repeating the same mistakes in all of the companies he'd run. That all ran into the ground. They all had the same story. So I think people are more gracious if they feel you've learnt. When you do if you think about Poppy, Poppy the makeup, she did the lipstick, Poppy King, I think it was. She went out of business and she's back and people are applauding her because she's found a way to survive. And I think that people are a lot more gracious and understanding if you're owning your mistakes. So when you talk about Qantas, I think people are more upset that Alan Joyce doesn't really own his mistakes. It's very political and I don't know whether he can own his mistakes. But I think that's what causes people to trust you or not.
One of the things that in lots of conversations that I've had with founders over the last 30 years is a lament from founders that, they've got these key staff. Sometimes, particularly you go through these growth spurts where sometimes you've got key people who are getting paid more than you from time to time. But it's almost this ironic, why don't they care about this? And it's like, nobody will care about this as much as you. So just stop. And my advice to them all the time is just stop even that narrative in your head around comparing other people's love for your business to you. It's because it's not something that's ever going to satisfy you. How have you led your business and the people who work in it to care about it without comparing it to yourself?
I'm better at that now than I used to be because I used to be really upset. I'd be like, why do they want to take holidays at Christmas? Don't they know that we're trying to grow this company? Why didn't they? And I would be not understanding. And I think what has helped me is to understand that if they were actually like me, they would probably become my competitors and they probably would be a problem in the business. And so when I think about their roles and their positions in the business, I don't think that stuff anymore. And I think it's because I've understood now what their role is in the business. And I'm also past that hump of needing everyone to be doing everything. When you're growing a business and you need one person, they're doing 10 jobs and you've got 5 people like that. And so everybody's sort of trying to contribute. Now I'm at a point where I've got specialists in different roles and they've got very clear KPIs. So you can't really get resentful towards them because that's just not what they brought into, right? Where I get resentful is if I feel like they're taking the business for a ride. So, and especially in the remote world of, everyone's, working from home mostly, we've always been a remote workforce. But I have to say one thing I'm proud of is that I've never had to really track my people. I've never had to use software to make sure they're doing what they're doing, they're saying what they're doing. And I think it's because I genuinely trust them. And to be honest with you, if they want to take half a day off, I don't really care as long as they do their work well the rest of the time. Where I get upset is if they're not doing their work well and they're kind of not around and you don't really know why, and you have to have those conversations with them that this isn't okay and this is why it's not okay and these are the things that are happening and that needs to change. And if they don't change, that's when I get resentful. And then I have to go into damage control because then I have to either performance manage them out or, defend why they're still in the business or, it becomes messier. But in terms of caring as much as I care, I now accept that nobody will care as much as I care, except for shareholders and the people who have been there from the beginning.
It's amazing how often people don't have those conversations. It's Shakespeare said, "Love dies a death by 1,000 cuts," and often that's how the employee relationships or culture within an organisation that you can takes a decade to build a culture and about 10 minutes to blow it back up. But it often happens as almost like a haystack of things you walked past or conversations you didn't have. But having those conversations quickly and in the moment, often I think is very telling how people respond. I think the people that I've worked with and enjoyed working with the most are ones where I had a tough conversation with them or, that's not okay, or you made this mistake, that mistake will never happen again with you and me, but you're in charge of the next decision. And the people I've worked with and who I respect the most are the ones where rather than go, all right, I'm leaving, how dare you speak to me like that, are the ones that have gone, yeah, and have responded incredibly. Yeah. And of course, when you see that happen, of course, it rewards you for having those little conversations. But I've always been surprised when people then start arguing about, like you can see that they've not delivered what they said they were going to deliver or it's not to the standard that was set or expected around here, all of those sort of things, and then start arguing with you. I've been doing this for 25 years as a CEO and I still go, what? Why are we having this conversation?
Well, the way I always like to think of it is how would they be describing the situation to their family when they come to work or when they're at dinner table? And what do they say about me as a boss around that table? And you can see some people who always have an excuse. They've always got an excuse as to why something didn't work out. It's always someone else's fault. It's always someone else who should have fixed it or caught the mistake. And I typically find that those people don't last that long because you either have to manage them out because anyone who makes a mistake and can't own it is a big problem for me. One thing I try to do in my team meetings is whenever we broach a subject, I do try to say, and I mean it, we're not a perfect company. We make mistakes. So this is what we're doing now. And I feel like I need to remind people because I think it's very easy for people to think of a company as this infrastructure and it's me versus them. But when they actually broke it down, they just see actually it's just a group of people who are trying to build this product or make this thing happen. And we're all kind of in this sort of cog trying to make it work. They have a little bit more grace or compassion for the business if that they deal with you on that level. But if you're kind of up here and you're saying, well, you're not doing this right, and I think that's where resentment comes and it becomes more problematic in the culture. Doesn't mean that you don't... I'm a big believer in tough conversations, but I'm also a confrontational person by nature. So it's not difficult for me to have a difficult conversation. It's more difficult for me to have a conversation that's actually less harmful for the other person. Because I can be very, why did this happen? So I've had to learn how to taper that. Rather than learning how to have hard conversations, I've had to learn how to have hard conversations in thoughtful ways.
Yeah. It's thoughtful. Okay, because that was my next question is how do you have those difficult conversations? What would be your advice to leaders to have difficult conversations when they try to avoid it and not very good at confrontation? I know for me, I'm really not good at having those difficult conversations. So what would be your advice for
I think you need to, before you have the conversation, understand what's happening. Because I think what happens is you go into a conversation with only a little bit of understanding of the situation. And you might be mad at that person because that person's done it before. And of course they've done it again. But if you don't know everything, you can be tripped up in that initial discussion, which actually puts you on the back. Because if they say, well, no, actually, you didn't know that this happened and that. And, so you try to know as much as you can. But I think the way you have a difficult conversation is by making it less about you and them and more about the situation. So rather than it being, why did you do this? It's like, well, this was meant to happen by this date because of these 3 things. And those people are waiting for it. What do we need to do to make sure that we don't miss that deadline again? Or what do we need to do to make sure it's at a quality level that doesn't have to be sense checked by 10 people? And why? And just, and ask them to problem solve it with you rather than defend their position. Because I have done this. I have pushed people into the corner so hard to defend their position because I couldn't understand why they did it. But that does not help anyone. That doesn't make them see things clearly. It doesn't make them respect you more. And then they tend to leave, right? They're the ones that will go. And it's because you push them into a corner, questioning them as opposed to giving them the tools to be better. Now, not everyone, I haven't had anyone leave the business that I really, really wanted them to stay. And I don't mean that in a bad way. I just mean it's always been the right fit if it's parted, right? It's run its course, or it's just not the right person for that role anymore. And so I think for me, every time anything happens, I do have to reflect on my part in that. But I really try to knock people into a position where they have to defend. And that's hard for me.
It was interesting. A mentor taught me, I was a bit like you, Alex, where I was like, let's just talk about this and work it out. And a mentor said to me, quite a long time ago, said, be tough on issues and soft on people. And he said, so before you're going to go into a confrontation, think about how you're going to be tough on the issue and soft on the person. I'd go, man, that was totally not my plan. Now I'm going to have to slow this down. And the other thing that the same mentor said to me is there's nothing more powerful than a person who doesn't care about winning. So don't try and win the argument. Try and address the issue and don't win the argument. And if it's important to them, because if you're in the winning the argument, there's going to be a winner and a loser. And if you want losers in your business, do that. And I was like, I don't want losers. And he said, so make it not about winning, make it about fixing and learning. And wow, that was, for me, that was such always a pause moment, because it was I would get frustrated with, I couldn't stand mediocrity and I would be frustrated with it. And I would visibly be upset about it and then be...
And I'm not adding with.
Yeah. And then I'd be surprised why, I'd get feedback like, you're being intimidating. And I'm like, how can I be intimidating? This is ridiculous.
I'm aggressive. Yeah. I had someone call my COO and say, I don't want to work directly with Alex. I can work under her, but not directly with her. I can't report to her. It's too intense.
And it's sometimes it's as a leader, when you get feedback like that.
Yeah.
I can remember some of the most injuring feedback for me was that it was being intimidating, and then I didn't realize that, of course, I had some wonderful people around me who very cleverly made me do media skills training. They put me in front of a camera and they keyed up a journalist to ask me nice questions, and they saw the look on my face when they were asking me nice questions. And then they got her to ask me questions they knew would annoy me.
Trigger.
And I can remember we were talking about young people, and it was SYC, we were talking about young people and having a homelessness experience and how but unfortunately, a lot of them were young women. And so we're talking about that, and we need to do better. And then the journalist talked about how do young women survive when they're on the street and all of those sort of things. And I said, well, unfortunately, a large proportion experience sexual assault during that time because they're in vulnerable position. And the journalist was keyed up to then ask, but surely some of them, put themselves in that. And I was like, what? And then they all played it back and they said, so do you see your face when she asked you that? You leaned forward, you dropped your voice and you glared at her. That's what we're talking about. You've got to stop doing that. And one of the things that I realised was like, yeah, I can't stop doing that. So what I need to do is explain it and go from time to time in a conversation. Sometimes if you say something really interesting that I'm curious about, I do the same face. So I've learned to explain. So I'm not going to say, if you said something silly or you said something interesting, you're going to get the same face. But it because I realise I'm going to glare at you. So I might as well diffuse it now and say, if I start glaring at you, it's because you're really interesting.
Yeah, exactly. I'm just so fascinated by you. I'm rolling my
You contain it though.
I don't.
Yeah.
I'm not good at it. And to be honest with you, when this person said I can't work directly with Alex, I'm like, cool, work with that person. It didn't make me want to change myself. What makes me change myself is when I feel like it's having an impact on the morale of people around me, or I feel they feel belittled or things like that. That's what I do try to work. And so that's why I try to make it more about the issue than the person. But in terms of my responses or my knee-jerk reactions, I know that sometimes they can be intense, but at the same time, I'm an intense person, and that's how I am. And as long as I'm not harmful or hurting other people in the process, if I make people slightly uncomfortable by my reaction, I'm okay with that, to be honest with you. But if I'm injuring a culture because of my behaviour, then that's a totally different ballgame, and I wouldn't deserve to be a CEO. So it comes down to, the line of where that crosses.
Yeah. As an intense person, how do you get on with intense people?
They make more sense to me.
Yeah.
Okay.
Like really intense people make more sense to me. I've spoken to people where they'd be like, I'm really intense and I do this and I'm always switched on and blah, blah, blah. And I'm like, I get you more than I might get someone else who's more chilled out. Or
Is your husband intense, or is he chilled out? Does he balance you out?
So I would describe my husband as the love child of Larry David and Jerry Seinfeld. They're constantly a little bit befuddled, a little bit irritated. Their stomach hurts a little bit and they're annoyed by something around them. But he's very chill in the sense that he's not, that he can wake up and just do things around the house and relax and enjoy the day. Whereas I'm a little bit more intense in the opposite way. But he isn't relaxed in his feelings about things. Do you see what I mean? He's as intense as me, but he channels that into, reading really interesting books on history and understanding them and trying to make sense of them. And so he's not. However, the personality the personality I struggle with the most is probably the amiable kind of sort of passive. They don't want to upset anyone. They don't really know if they should say anything. Maybe they'll come forward about something, but maybe they won't. I don't understand those people. That's the personality I struggle with the most.
Oh, you know what's funny? I got in trouble with my wife one time because there'd been this long run of us just doing what I wanted with this group of friends. And she was like, why do we end up always doing what you want? And I said, because nobody minds. Because when I say, what do you want to do? They go, I don't mind. But I do. So we'll do what I want. Yeah, I mind. So we'll do what and she was like, well, you're not giving people space. I'm like, what does that mean? If I ask you, what do you want to do, and you don't know what you want to do?
That's your chance to say it.
That's what I reckon, right? Apparently that's intimidating. But I was like,
I get it.
I love that. Like if someone takes that ownership in my friendship, all right, we're going to do that. All right, cool, let's do it.
Yeah, that's what I think.
Yeah.
I also feel like I'm at an age now where there's certain things I don't care about. So I care about, for example, how I impact other people in a meeting at work as a boss, but I also don't really care if everyone thinks I'm selfish because I want to see this play and not that. I don't really care. I'm not going to waste my time on things I don't want to do.
Okay. Yeah.
When did that start kicking in? Has that always been a character trait, or is it been a character trait that's always been there but is getting more intense, or is it just something that you're more comfortable with?
When I was a kid, I was like that because I was an only child and I was very, this is how it's going to be and watch my performance, please, and, that kind of stuff. And then as an adult, I lost my confidence because, when you go through those teenage years and those 20s, you're kind of not sure and you're playing in a game that you don't really understand. So when I was at uni and I was running a department for the Department of Education, all these different things, I always felt a little bit like I wasn't quite sure what I was doing. And then it's taken about 5 or 6 years of the business taking off, and then me realizing that, hang on, I know how to do this. I don't know how to do that, but I can pay someone to do that. I feel more confident in who I am. And also, I think it helps to just remember that nobody really cares. You're going to be dead and they're not going to remember you.
I heard, I don't know who said it. I gave Ricky Gervais credit for it, but I'm not sure it was him. Yeah, who said, have you ever seen a hearse with a U-Haul trailer? Like all your stuff doesn't go with you.
I don't know. I feel like comments like that though are like, I feel like they're all about money. Like you shouldn't care about money because you can't take it with you. Okay, but you could probably get a nicer coffin. I don't know. I'm just saying that like, it's just, I just feel like I don't really care. Like there are certain things that are important to me that aren't important to other people. And I've kind of lost that care factor of if that they like it or not. So I just kind of do my own thing. But I do think that, I do often think about, what will the world look like when I'm not here anymore. And I do want to feel like my company has given people jobs. It does make me feel good that I've woken up and I've created a business and I pay for people's mortgages and they go to work. And it's kind of cool to think that, all these people are there because of you. But at the same time, they don't care about you. They only care about what you give them, which is a paycheck and some meaning.
Mm. You do care about things deeply though. And you, outside of work, you do charitable work. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
So I co-founded a publication called The Jewish Independent. It was called Plus 61J prior to recently being rebranded as The Jewish Independent. When it was called Plus 61J, it's a news site about Israeli politics for the Jewish community in Australia, right? And you can imagine how intense that is right now with the war going on. But when we started it, it was called Plus 61J, and we had to rebrand because people thought of it as like a dating website for over 60-year-old Jews. But it was just one of those things. So we changed it to The Jewish Independent. That's an important part of my life because it is a way to contribute to critical thought and analysis in what is a very difficult time. And we really try to have different views of what's happening with Gaza and everything. So that's really important to me. The other stuff that I do, I'm on a couple of boards of things that I believe in. Shalom Gamarada is one of them, which is a scholarship fund for Indigenous Australians to go to law school or medical school. And I'm also involved in a really cool startup in New York called Gold Comedy, which is all about comedy for women and non-binary people doing sketch comedy. And it's really cool. And it's a not-for-profit. Well, it's not-for-profit in my view. It's not not-for-profit for them. But like I said, it's a philanthropic thing that I love being a part of.
Isn't comedy one of those things that we love and value, but also don't realise what an incredible vehicle it is for liberating people? The late Dave Flanagan, who was a great Australian comedian and just a really good human being, ran a restaurant called the Comedy Cellars in Adelaide. And I remember him coming to me with this idea that he could take really disadvantaged long-term unemployed people and increase their confidence and employability by getting them to do comedy. And at the time I was like, what? But we took a chance on it. And Dave, the people that he had come were people who'd either never worked, or one man that was part of his program had not worked for 1,000 weeks. That's 20 years. And they had not eaten in restaurants. But he ran a comedy restaurant. So part of them coming for the program was that they would eat in a restaurant, and he would sneak up on them because they didn't even know that he was teaching them how to go to a restaurant. And
cool.
And then he would pay them. He'd say things like, Australian comedy is really dark And so really crummy things are really funny in Australia. So you guys must be fucking funny. And they go, I know you're looking at me and you're grumpy because, I got you up at the crack of 12 and you missed out on your third bong. And he would just pay them out. But after 6 weeks, he would take a video of them and these people would have beanies on. They'd look really angry. And really what they were doing was controlling. They knew people were going to reject them. So rather than do that, they looked objectionable. So they felt like they were in control. Yeah. 6 weeks later, you would see these people all dressed up, knew how to eat in a restaurant, who would give a comedy act. But what he would do is he would have them all dressed up, get on stage and do a comedy show, and he would invite employers to watch them. Yeah. And the employers would be like, oh, this girl is amazing. Could I give you a job? And these were people that 6 weeks before no employer would have said that. And he used comedy to liberate, to say, all this darkness, all this fear you fear and rejection and hate and all those different things, that's comedy and it's an asset, so you use your asset. It was such an incredible thing that he was doing before he died, called Stand Up with Confidence. But,
I didn't know about that. That's amazing. Well, I really believe that comedy is the thing to bind people. That's the thing that connects people in society to ideas. And also, to your point about, people can't really say terrible things about you if you're already saying it about yourself. You know what I mean? Like if there's that self. I'm a big believer in being self-deprecating, not because of a low confidence thing. It's more just around it is what it is, right? And if you know yourself, you can feel more confident in talking about your flaws. I don't see my flaws as that big of a deal. I try to learn from my mistakes. But
and we know that from content, successful content, the most engaging content is entertaining. And when you add humour into that, especially when it's, it could be addressing some big issues, people can really react to it and listen to it and engage with it. And then some of these big changes can happen. It's
going back to what you said before around how do we get people to, listen to the news and get off Instagram and TikTok, for example. I actually think that the humour element from those platforms, because of people dealing with such serious issues, is what gets them the biggest audience. Yeah. It's not the people that are saying it really seriously. It's the people that are bringing humour or bringing an assertive view to it, or that's the kind of stuff that people respond well to.
Yeah, you look at people like Jimmy Kimmel talking about serious things, but in a comedic way, and there's a lot, Stephen Colbert and a whole bunch of those. But it's a good way of diffusing what are often very hot conversations, aren't they? Irrespective of what you think. The comedy at least makes it somewhat approachable as opposed to volatile.
That's something I've never understood when people criticize comedians or actors or playwrights for being too political in their artwork, because I've always understood artwork to be somewhat political. I mean, if you read Dostoevsky, if you watch a play, it always has a political undercurrent. It's just, and I think that comedians have an obligation to use what's happening in the world and to present it to you as an audience with a comedic lens. That's what you should be doing. So to pretend things aren't happening, I just think is a moronic way to expect someone to show them your art. You know what I mean?
Should CEOs be engaged in political discourse? There's been a fair bit of toing and froing on this as to whether during the voice debate that there were lots of CEOs coming out in favour of the voice and those sort of things, and then equally there were people saying, well, you should just get on with your business and stay out of these conversations. What's your view on whether, in things as important as the voice conversation, that do CEOs have a role in that, or should CEOs get on with their business?
I think CEOs have an obligation to be authentic. And if their company is in any way impacted by the matters that they're talking about, I think that they should be able to speak about it. It comes down to how annoying it is, right? So when you have a CEO who has nothing to do with what they're talking about, but they're trying to get on Sky News or the ABC to talk about an issue that there's nothing to do with them, and they don't really, it is more of an issue of do they understand what they're talking about, rather than should they be leaning into something that's political? I have often stayed neutral on certain issues because of my role with a publication wanting to have different views. So I don't want to have my personal lens, impact the publication or the editorial work that they do. In saying that, there are some things that are really important to me that I don't really care if the audience disagrees with me or my editorial team disagrees with me. I'll talk about it. So during COVID, for example, I did talk a lot about, the vaccination stuff and how important it was to be educated and understand. And that actually upset a lot of people. But I felt really strongly about that, to talk about it. So I think it just depends on the why behind why you're wanting to talk about something. If you're just trying to be political because you want to be relevant, people can pick up.
Yep. That authenticity, so important as a CEO and leader.
Alex, what advice would you give 16-year-old Alex now?
I would say to 16-year-old Alex to enjoy things more and to take more seriously my studies. Because as a teenager, I didn't spend those years studying, and I didn't spend the first few years of my 20s studying. I definitely made up for it. But I think that I would have rather, had I looked back on it, I would have rather spent more time enjoying life and not worrying about things such as how do I look and whether or not people like me or the normal stuff you think about when you're a teenager. I wish that I'd thought less about that and thought more about what's possible and to have read more and to learn more and that's what I would have preferred to do. And I think that a lot of young people don't really understand how much the stuff that they think about doesn't matter at all in 5 years' time.
What would 16-year-old Alex say to 2024 Alex? What advice would she give you?
You really need to tan again. This is an issue that we need to talk about. But also, I have to say, and Paul, you know this, I just came off a bit of a holiday with my family who came here from New York, and we went to Tasmania and Cairns, and I snorkeled, I had fun, I went to dinners every night, I walked up a mountain. I didn't walk, I strolled up a mountain. I was on boats, and I genuinely didn't check my emails the whole time. Like I did at night, but I didn't spend my time anxious. And I think the thing that I would tell myself as a 16-year-old to just chill out with your thoughts is the same thing I would tell myself now, but the opposite. So chill out with your thoughts. The business is still going to be there. It's not life or death.
Yep.
Now we're getting into the really heavy duty questions. Now, Alex, from The Big Smoke, your 3 favourite songs that make you smile if they come on the radio.
I am a big fan of Chopin. So pretty much any of the nocturnes, any of the compositions I love. But then if you're talking about actual songs, I'm embarrassed, but I really like Beyonce and I really like it, like some of her newer stuff. And then my final third song that I probably love more than anything is Queen with I Want to Break Free.
That's excellent. And what 3 movies are your favourites that you would watch over and over again?
I would probably choose a Betty Davis movie that not a lot of people really enjoyed, but I really enjoyed it. And it was the one with Joan Crawford. I'm just like, I got a mental blank now. I can't remember the name of it. But do you know what I'm talking about? Joan Crawford and Betty Davis.
Oh, you're right. It was the one that not many people know about.
Yeah.
Whatever happened to Baby Jane?
Oh, there you go.
Okay.
Whatever happened to Baby Jane? The other movie, they're not a movie but a show I would always watch that I can never get sick of is The Golden Girls. Anything Golden Girls related. And then the final one is probably one of the Monty Python films.
Yeah,
but
that's funny.
Yeah. Is that interesting? Whoever thought of putting Estelle Getty and Betty White together was
amazing. Genius.
Amazing. Yeah,
and it was such a progressive show for the 80s. Like it was so progressive in the themes and the humour. It still makes me laugh today.
Yeah, excellent. Alexandra from The Big Smoke, thank you so much for joining us. It's been brilliant. We really loved having you.
Alex.
Thank you. Cool. It was fun.